Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. With me today, I have Markus Müller, who is a advisory partner with TPA here in Austria, which is a Big Ten advisory accounting firm, part of BakerTilly. And in his role as advisory partner, he's responsible for digital transformation, sustainability, and risk management. Hi there, Markus.
Hi there. Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Great to have you here. Markus is also author of the Service Integration and Management Professional Body of Knowledge. So he's a very experienced person in the technology sphere. Let me start by asking what are the things that you do in recent times on projects, etc. What are the services that you help clients with?
Yeah, so I've been responsible to establish the new digital advisor and transformation business line. I do this since 2023. Consulting focuses on one hand, the digital transformation, which incorporates new operating models. Obviously, things like process optimization, competence of how to manage process in the organizations. There's a big skill management part of this, so that we really strengthen organizational competencies. It's about the so-called soft factors, as they are not always so soft as they appear. And another area of consulting is digital trust. So these services are to strengthen resilience of organizations. We establish with our clients, we optimize control systems. We expand their risk management. Often there is risk management, but what about an integrated risk management? Yeah? Right. We provide audit-related services. This advisory part I'm in does not the audit itself, but audit-related, so preparation, follow-up of audits. And then last but not least, there is this big topic about digital sustainability. So it's the interface between sustainability, which is decades old, and data. So
Right.
It's all about data, sustainability in context of architecture, the implementation of regulations, and you name it.
Right. Well, those soft elements, factors in projects they're usually the hardest thing to do. So people think, the hardcore implementation part is really for many enterprises really not the difficulty, the challenge that they're facing, but kind of the whole complexity around that. What I want to talk to you about today is trust, digital trust, and just to start off, like, how does it relate to technological advancements?
Great topic. I love it. And setting up the business, I really had to dive deeper into this trust topic. And to me, it's super important to clarify first, what is actually trust? Huh? Because you ask 5 people, you get 6 different answers, even if it's so fundamental. It's a part of behavior. It's part of our society. And I think let's define it this way. When you ask someone to trust you, there are basically 2 states involved. There's a known state. People like to be in the known state, and there's an unknown state. It could be your new boss, a stranger you just met, or a new service provider you want to integrate in your supply chain, whatever. So it could be anything, anyone. The line between those 2 things, the known and the unknown state, that's called risk. Risk is how we deal with uncertainty. And I think dealing with risk is one of the most basic competencies we find in management practices. But risk is still not trust. So what is trust? It's basically that remarkable power which puts us into the position that we trust the unknown. It's a trust in the unknown. It's a social glue that holds us together. And so when looking at trust in context of digital or in context of new platforms, for us, it's so important that we need to understand that trust flows differently. In the past, it was about individuals. So, people that your family, maybe the church or any religious organization. But bottom line is, we are all raised in this institutional trust age where we don't trust persons anymore, we trust institutions. And now we're on this edge of really a third type of trust, which we call digital trust. And that's so interesting in terms of what does it do with us? What's the rules of the game here when we talk about digital trust? I think you perfectly remember that people often talk about trust is in crisis. It's, you just need to open up the newspaper, crisis of trust. But the interesting thing is, I think it's the trust in institutions which is in crisis, not trust itself.
Right. It's just how this relates to the digital world, right? Because in the ever-evolving complexity that we live in, where, not only you had to have like this usual discussion around digitization, automation, just relying more and more on technology for everything, but now you have this probabilistic, magical AI stuff coming on top. And as far as trust goes, it only gets from difficult to very difficult. What are your thoughts on how does that play? What role does trust play in things that everyone should ask themselves and companies should ask themselves, and how to increase the confidence that they manage this properly?
Good question. For me, what's interesting to see is that information technology, digitalization in general, gives us this opportunity to trust each other or communicate with each other in general, independent from the place, the location where you are. It is a fundamental change to me. Therefore, some people call this digital trust also a decentralized trust, because we call it that way because trust unfolds via those new digital platforms and the business models behind them. It's funny because finally individuals again connect to each other, but individuals which are actually not meant to meet because they're living on different continents, planets, countries, whatever, and reach you have. Think about the influencers that are masters in using these types of trust mechanisms. This is incredible. This is totally new. It's very fundamental in the way how we trust each other, in my opinion. We can say that also when you look at new technologies and AI, these platforms are increasingly facilitated by algorithms and transformer architectures. And so the question is, do we understand who we trust? Is it an individual? We're connecting through these platforms, and this is how trust flows, or is it now an AI? Yes, and the new paradigm is in AI we trust. Is that good or bad? We can discuss. It depends. But it's super interesting to see that most business models, I don't know, like purchasing optimization through electronic marketplaces, or obvious business models and financial investments in the financial industry. When you have AI-based investments, or in general, sharing via social media. Regardless if you're the originator, it's getting hard to understand. Is it a bot I'm talking to? Is it a human being I'm talking to?
That's an interesting way to look at it, because on the one hand, what you're saying is that trust multiplies, like with the example of influencers, and multiplies exponentially with the size of the network. But then again, there's also the difficulty of mapping that onto a process, or like from an enterprise perspective, right? Because there's like, one is the individual promoting themselves and having like social capital in promoting certain things. But then if you think of it from an enterprise perspective, you trust institutions and process and not influencers and humans, right? So how does this play in this traditional business departments looking at their processes, digital processes, IT, trying to do their best to facilitate as much automation as possible, while at the same time not going into this old paradigm, shadow IT, but this is between business and IT. Like, where does trust sit and where should it sit?
I think this hits the nail when it comes to the changes in form of authority over technology that happen in each company everywhere. where traditionally IT organizations, they had this power because they had the knowledge and the means to say, don't worry about digital product, we're going to handle it. In my opinion, say it a bit brutally, traditional IT organizations are more and more stripped down to infrastructure providers, whereas the actual business logic and the business decisions go to the business where they belong to actually. The types of services are changing. And of course, that has to do with the ever increasing field of regulations where it's mostly people in the business that are responsible. And in most industries, it's not that IT is a secondary value generating function anymore. IT is the business. Right. So I think it's super important to understand that we also call it business-led IT, which means business can make their decisions. It's not that the dependency on the internal IT department creates actually a monopoly for the IT department. Its business can choose. It's
right.
A few clicks away. You swipe your credit card and you got a cloud provider that does things for you. So that has changed, doesn't it?
It has changed. And I remember the times, where we've been in discussions where someone said, well, don't look at this or that, in a negative way, because that's the classic business versus IT. And I'm like, I never signed up for that. I didn't sign anything on the traditional business versus IT. This is not a great way to think about it. And, the business led is how things should be. Whether that's the case at all companies is a secondary topic, but I guess that's exactly where, companies like yours, companies like mine would go in and solve individual questions for the customers to help them steer this cruise ship in the right direction, right? Which isn't a siloed IT, however you want to argue for a siloed IT, right? I think.
Totally agree. Yeah, go ahead.
The IT aspect is interesting because I was just reading the other day, I was just scrolling, and if someone recognizes themselves from was the author of that, please do comment below. But based something along the lines of, I didn't expect AI to be like my worst employee, right? Because you have to explain to them every individual step and, have to give proper instructions. Like, you don't want to have that. You want to have these agentic processes that basically have some level of intelligence to take decisions on the margin. How do you think, again, in the light of trust, this agentic AI would play a role where it would actually take it, maybe not the most crucial decision in the company in the beginning, but certainly go beyond generate certain text or, generate a score between 0 and 1. Where do you think this is going?
Interesting part is, as you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So culture is the thing that remains longest. And so is also the mechanisms of how trust flows. And since we're in this big transformation from a society perspective, most organizations still live in the age of institutional trust. And what is institutional trust? It's what we all know, where we feel like trust can be centralized. You have an authority, you have a hierarchy, and via this you can ensure that goals are set and the organization follows more or less, depending on leadership and other factors. But if you think about how it works and how trust is now decentralized, it's not bureaucratic anymore. We actually live in a hybrid situation. Let me conclude that. Service providers, producers still think and they act as if they remain in the age of institutional trust, but actually we're in distributed trust. Platforms like LinkedIn, Alibaba, they have this model of distributed power.
Does it also have to do something with, other than risk management, also performance management? But just to segue what you mentioned, this culture strategy for breakfast, we know and agree with what that means. I read it recently, a different take that, well, culture is BS because all of the high performing companies essentially have in all the leadership positions highly committed, highly driven people, which you could interpret as having a monoculture of high performance, which of course is a culture in and of itself, right?
To be honest, I believe that organizations are as different from each other as human beings are. There's no one human being on this planet that is the very same than another one. And so is it with organizations. Obviously, we're talking about patterns that would foster success, that would stimulate what's good, and that's about performance. By the way, AI is what technology can provide. It's 24/7 availability, which humans are not 24/7 available. You could argue that it's the classic argumentation that the more you put in efficiency and automation into that social system, the better the actors can, focus on stimulating the right culture and working with the people and their skills and maturing the organization as such, instead of getting drowned in bureaucracy and their day-to-day work. So to me, what's really interesting in this context is if you think about this everlasting conflict, or let's call it a dilemma between standardizing in the organization so it gets efficient, and the actual variability, or let's say the adaptability, keyword agile. Both somehow need to come together, as on the surface they are like a bit contradictory to each other.
Absolutely. I love this point. Yeah. I think I love this point because everyone understood, I love to hate agile, not because of agile, but the way everyone never thought for a moment that the idea behind picking a framework of agility, and I'm not saying the agile framework, but just as a semantic expression, framework of agility, and then saying we have to be absolutely religious in implementing this in that exact form. That is anything but agile, and that was absolutely skipped everywhere. That is a risk in and of itself. Is exactly what you mentioned.
It's a big risk, and it's ignoring the fact that each organization is different, and you can't apply what works in one culture in one organization to another one. So when we talk about culture, we don't mean necessarily the countries or regions culture. We mean company culture.
The way that the company works, right? Basically.
Yeah, it's expressed by symbols, typical phrases and sentences. It's actually expressed in a way that we don't recognize. It's like a fish in the water. The fish wouldn't be able to talk about the water because it's just there. And that's what culture is.
Well, if they had an agile coach and what was the other thing, and all the other rituals, they probably would, the fish at some point there would be like an adapter, and I'm just you could, but it wouldn't be the best, land surviving fish you've ever seen. So I fully agree with you. The thing, I want to get your opinion on, if you look at the context of Europe, and maybe Europe and the US, the way that supply chains are evolving and all the changes, due to geopolitical reasons, due to companies, managing their risks, or, offshoring certain processes in production. At the end of the day, all of that ties down to also, how data is used, how software is used, and how the compliance regulations are evolving both on the supply chain side and on the data and AI and technology side. What are the major developments that one should look for, and what is that European companies, and let's say Central Europe companies in particular, should pay attention to?
What jumps into my mind immediately is that major difference between the European region and United States in terms of the regulatory environment. I think it's typically for Europe that we're going, as they call it, the rule-based way of conducting business. So we have the circular economy initiatives, we have the Green Deal, we have a lot of complexity, a lot of, let's say, regulatory efforts for ethical practices that would then also explain the desired behavior for how we would like to do business. And also there's a good reason for intervention by states and by European Union in how we conduct business, because obviously wherever there's a shortage of long-term perspective, you need to regulate something. That's okay. However, when you look at supply chains in the US, the structures are different, and the type of legislation and also say, legal stimulation of business is totally different, in my opinion. And that's interesting because in Europe, we talk about you are allowed to do this and there are penalties for this and that. But in the US, there's more stimulation, in my opinion. There's more
nudging in the direction.
Yeah, nudging, incentives. Yeah? Alone, if you think about it, was called the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. I mean, isn't that clever to call something inflation reduction, but it's content-wise the very same thing like the Green Deal in the end.
It's government spending, right? So
exactly.
how that is inflation reduction is just beyond absolutely any economist's wildest dreams of how you can define something that is such that it isn't. So I fully agree. But the interesting thing you mentioned is, like, look at the EU AI Act. Like, there's a recurring, I have a few guests on a podcast, and everyone's like, well, we need regulation. But it is always like, okay, regulation is good. We agree. But, and we probably might disagree. And so the silver lining is, like, European companies were so happy about it because now they have legal clarity of what they can and cannot do, which is not the way American companies operate. They don't expect that legal clarity to be there. They expect to act first, maybe, kind of manage the risk and legal risk and all sorts of risk along the way. Whereas European companies, like, okay, we weren't really sure what we should do with AI, but now that we have the categories and the subcategories and all the rules, and we can go about our way and have like clarity, which is just a different, I guess it's just a different way of looking at things. Doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, so long as there's good ways to obviously not fall directly into the harshest of fines that companies would face, but rather be guided also by the regulatory bodies, individual countries on if they act in good faith, obviously how to manage these risks, because no one, including the regulators, has any experience with dealing with that. Let's be honest. It's not like regulating classical things like building or anything where there's like ton of knowledge and experience, decades and hundreds of years of experience of doing it. So what do you think should be the stance of European companies approaching this dilemma on whether they should be bold and do more with AI, whether they should be more cautious and be kind of like laggards on that? What's the optimal advice look for? How does it look for a, your average European CEO, some of the companies you guys serve here in the region?
Good question. For me, I think we're talking about basically a dilemma, which is the market demand that drives how I do the business and the regulatory requirements that we have to take into consideration, and a balancing act between those two in the end. So I think instead of waiting for regulations, a company have a good advice if they just proactively adopt things. A good friend of mine is a state attorney in Germany, and I talked to him about regulation. He's a legal guy, so he says to me, law always anticipates some people violating something. A law is always put in place if the common sense is not enough anymore, normal business conduct. To me, there's nothing stopping you from proactively innovating based on market demands, and at the same time trying to adopt to, let's say, greener practices or ethical thinking in the AI, or whatever the next big shiny regulation that comes around the corner will be. If you voluntarily adhere to certain standards, business conduct, you're on a good side. Your effort is still high. There's a lot of bureaucracy to then prove things and to make things transparent. But the bottom line is there's nothing stopping you from innovating in Europe.
Your advice would be, I fully agree with that. And I think it's also an advantage where our companies should use this and say, by the way, if you use our services which are backed by AI, it's made in the EU. We're compliant. We're doing our best to be compliant. So your level of trust with us should be higher than all these others, geographies that maybe don't have those standards. And so, that's, I think, something that we should use as a marketing point for Europe, just like data protection. Like if you want to put your data somewhere, you want to have it in Europe and you don't want to have it someplace else for the same reasons. So, but
there's
yeah, go ahead.
Because for me, there's one aspect which I think there's, in my observation, a complete misconception about the relationship between transparency, creating trust, or transparency through compliance, and the level of trust that we should create with our customers, as well as with our employees, of course. Because many people think that solution to make everything more transparent in order to improve trust. It's not the solution, in my opinion. You remember probably what happened with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. More transparency does not automatically mean more trust. I mean, I'm not saying that trust or transparency is bad. It has good effects. And if you design a product and you describe the product in ways that make it very transparent, that's very good. But companies often communicate that they're becoming now more transparency after the fact, when the crisis already happened. And that's kind of strange. It's strange on one hand because trust is nothing you can increase yourself. The trust in you, trust is given to you.
Exactly.
Yeah? So I can't say after the crisis, oh, we're going to increase the trust now. Where's the bottom that gives me that trust increase? It's the customers that put trust in me and my company.
This is so valid, and I'm immediately thinking, even in traditional industries, you see what's happening with aircraft manufacturing, whether they, I mean, ultimately they will gain that trust back, but it's gonna take them forever to do so, because the market sees with great attention what's happening. Even though but you see, this is exactly the after the crisis, exactly what they're doing now. They're being way more transparent, just out of abundance of transparency. And I think it only exacerbates, if you will, not as the wrong thing, but in the short term, it only makes the problem worse for them, right?
But it does. Regulation, it's like a layer of artificially created transparency. Yeah?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Interesting. I'm always trying to connect this and say, well, what does that mean for our companies? What does it mean for companies that we can, that we advise, that we, do business with?
I have one observation. I think that most people, they manage data the same way like they manage process, which is in a more often in a siloed way. Yeah. So that's one of the challenges that I see in many companies. And this fragmentation or siloed way of doing things is understandable because, I mean, that's how our brains are wired. It's how we do things for 30,000 years since we came down from the trees. We create kingdoms and we always need to know socially if you're part of a group or not. We and they, and that's how it's wired in our brains, and that's why it's naturally that we create these silos. But in modern work life, silos and fragmentation pose a huge challenge. It doesn't matter if it's the processes that use the data or the data itself. This is the key problem that I can see. And that's why I actually, together with other authors, created this service integration body of knowledge to make sure that we kind of avoid the negative impact of silos because they reduce overall data quality, make it difficult to trust the data. And how to do that? There's even an ISO norm out there, ISO 8000, long-term, long-standing. Yeah.
Interesting that you mentioned siloed I certainly see this across projects, across customers, that there is still this hoarding of data within individual departments. Especially when you try to re-platform, do these transformation initiatives to get away from, because you follow the way your systems work, right? If your systems are siloed and you have to work in a siloed way, well, then you have a siloed way of working, whether you like it or not. And once someone centrally, with the help of consultants or through top management initiatives, try to break that, even if you sit with all of the division heads, everyone in the room, and says, okay, we don't want to be siloed, there's half of them that are like, yeah, but still push back to be more siloed for reasons that they argue, would limit their autarky in dealing with problems. Like they have to be dependent on this central unit for this and that and the other, because it's usually about centralizing the way, it's just optimizing decision rights around data governance and around data platforms. And so if you come up with a good approach, is what you're saying, on explaining why this siloed way of thinking is just generally wrong for their particular business, mapped in a way where they understand it, where they can see why this would not be the most optimal solution a year or 2 years from now, a good chance that we could see more, more investments, more initiatives, more things done, where both sides trust each other, kind of the party that wants to drive the transformation, but also the people that should really live through the transformation and actually oftentimes relinquish control of certain, process of certain data, and for the greater good of the company, really. So is there a top management aspect here that's missing?
Yeah, I mean, you almost gave the answer to the question. And I totally agree. It is first and foremost a matter of personal maturity as a leader, that you actually learn the art of letting loose and let go, and let people do their thing, and support them, serve them. Young people I see often, they're totally focused on efficiency, and they are super in being efficient. And the more you mature, the more effectiveness is important, not efficiency. So you do the right things, and that is, to me, a good advice to people, to think about doing the right things, not only doing the things you've been told you shall do in the best and most efficient way, but also being effective, being visible in the organization and at the customer base, and making a difference. Another aspect how to do this, and that usually also works, is we're coming back to this topic of standardization versus individual solutions. But standardization plays a crucial role, especially when it comes to collaboration across legal boundaries. The better you standardize, the more you have a chance to really be effective and not letting communication breakdowns happen at the edge of your silo, so to say. So I think it's super important that standardization also enables automation. The better something is standardized, the better it's automated. That's the logical chain, how I would explain it to them, and say the more you automate it, the better your control over the data, and you eliminate human error.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. There's this in decade-old dance business and IT. There's this thing where IT is always trying to prove that, I mean, it's all standard. We aren't, unique on the market. Let's take this standard solution, where the business is always trying to prove, no, we are very special. We have to have our own particular solution because we are so idiosyncratic in the way we do things. And there's this, tension whether to standardize and whether to customize. It's ultimately something that, the entire management layer should agree on, I think.
Absolutely. It's funny. I'm now 3 decades into my job. It's funny to see how things are repeating, mistakes are repeating. And I said, each organization is individual. It's correct, of course. But as a good enterprise architect, what you do is you define what is core to everything, what's the standard that can be standardized versus what is differentiating this organization, this company from others, and how do these things interact with each other. That's the art of architecting an enterprise in a sustainable way.
Exactly. And this is why this enterprise architect role and advisory role is so key, because this is where you need the deep thinkers, the people who really, really think this through in a more longer term, as you mentioned, and aren't just, trying to cobble together some sort of a solution that will get the job done quickly, because there's always a way to kind of, mess it up and with 10% less effort. But then if you do this repeatedly, very soon you're not gonna like the position that your company is in. So
Sure.
yeah, and this is where just sometimes we have the ability to step in as external advisors, and the ability to bring in some fresh ideas are so valuable, despite the fact that implementation wise people will be, well, we could have done this on our own. Yes, very true, but you didn't. And the more interesting aspect is what people fail to realize, I think certainly applies to your company as well, that we as consulting companies also get advisors for many things to advise us, so that we sort of our own perspective is challenged. We don't just come up with everything on our own. But yeah, but I think this different way of looking at things is super important to move away from established thinking in organizations. The way processes are done, even something as new as digitization, is already very old, right? And we've seen it repeat itself over and over again for quite many. For quite some decades. Yeah. So yeah.
I would say a lot of professionals in digitalization do good if they turn to their IT department and they got some older people sitting there maybe, but they have good advice for them because they've done the same mistakes a decade ago, for example. It's funny if you see how, as a business leader, you need to establish a good asset management, for example. Managing assets is commodity in IT.
Yep.
Talk to each other.
Exactly. And we had a discussion with Matt Fornito from the AI advisory group. This is another podcast that should be online by now, where one of the interesting things we discussed is the role of the CEO, right? Previously, what are your thoughts on this? Like whether they should be more technical, less technical? Earlier, you mentioned that IT is now core part of the business. Does that mean that basically across functions, everyone should be very, very IT literate to the point that they weren't? Like, do you see this as one of the changes compared to, let's say, how things were 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, how they were done?
I think the roles, the CIO, CD role, CEO, all these roles, they rapidly evolved. Basically, if you look at the different businesses and how authority is distributed. For me, I think as a CEO, I do not necessarily need to be a very technology oriented. What's most important to me is that you have a very clear vision about how you want to drive the company, and that this vision is by coincidence maybe a data-driven way of conducting business and driving a company. Well, that's then a natural process of your visionary and your work with the goals as leader of that company. Yeah? So I would say there are always people that know more about technology than you if you're a leader. So let these guys do their job and make sure that you understand enough so that you can create the reporting system, the metrics, and the things that actually help you to have an effective instrument to lead this organization.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly correct. Just in the same way that you would be able to understand, read the balance sheet and the P&L, and then you'd have your CFO who's more knowledgeable on setting up the proper, let's say, the finance function, but you'd still understand kind of the KPIs and the basic elements to drive the business. Because one thing you mentioned is being data driven. What would be your definition of being data driven? Like when can a company when should they aspire to be data driven, and how to, if they want to be data driven, how to define it?
Yeah. For me, the absolute essential part in being data driven means that it's the decision-making process. Because I know many organizations, as you previously said, they collect a lot of data, structured and unstructured. They got the data fabrics and networks and all of it. However, the question is what to do with the data. And so to me, it is about decision making. And this is always in context of the customer. Because as we know, it's not that the company dies from one day to the next. Suddenly, it's a very slow death by disconnecting from your customers. So driving relentlessly to understand customers by interpreting the data. Analysts have this term data storytelling, which is, by the way, a great application of artificial intelligence. Let those algorithms really give you some clues about what's in this endless data that you can't really get a grasp on as human being. But here we got the advantage. Use the data analytics and try to make use and meaning of the data. That's, to me, a data-driven culture.
Certainly going only to increase in importance. You alluded to sustainability earlier, and I think of all of the CO2 climate-related reporting. Just a bulk of regulation coming globally for this. If your company impacted in multiple jurisdictions, and not only you're going to have to make, you will need to create reporting on this, but you have to generally think on how you gather the data, how you organize it, how you view and take decisions on it. How do you think this sustainability trend is impacting the data side, just more generally the data side of things, and what will be important going forward? CSRD and the like,
yes,
but also local regulations in many countries.
In the end, it's an extrinsic motivation. Regulation is always an extrinsic motivation, and it's there to stimulate that data-driven audits that we will see in sustainability. They're all based on the question of how good does the data reflect reality. And when it comes to sustainability, I've been responsible in a huge Fortune 500 company to set up the GRC, and that included ESG practices and KPIs. And I can tell you more than 80% of the effort goes into acquiring and finding this data, because the data is simply not there. It's not available. And if it's available, it's certainly not available in a form or shape that can be used, especially when you think about most of the greenhouse gases and basic data. Let's talk about the employees and, basic KPIs. Most of this data is actually outside your own company. It's in the supply chain. And so that's why it's so hard to get to the data. And I think the practices to be more efficient in reporting when it comes to sustainability are really about how you manage your supply chain. So it's interdisciplinary cooperation between the supply chain management, the procurement, the legal, HR, and you name it. So that's what makes it so difficult. And I think the data collection and the integration of the data, there we as consultants have a lot of offerings. We can do a lot of good things simply by creatively taking what worked in other contexts into the sustainability context. So how to report, how to govern the data, how to make sure there's ownership on the data. That's super important, and that determines how effective you are.
And also, what people fail to realize is it's not a one-off exercise. You have to set up these processes for these pipelines that will continue to work. I mean, love it, but does this help us in any other way? And the answer is obvious. Yes, you could do more granular decision making on various aspects of your process as a byproduct, really, of the data you gather up the supply chain in your locations in whatever countries you operate in that you otherwise wouldn't, look at it, in such granular way. And I see this as a huge chance to set up proper data management initiatives in place, and just really enhance the data-driven culture that you mentioned. Yeah. By doing this, and sort of also combining it with also understanding your own footprint in terms of CO2, etc. Maybe not the worst thing that you could do. So I think a company should look this in a very positive way, and not just there's just a few more cost blocks coming our way here and there.
I talk to CFOs and they say, oh, that's so much bureaucracy. Who shall pay for it? It's full FTE I need to spend. I say, well, it's going to be more than one FTE, but bottom line, this thinking comes from if you do things the way you do them today, then it will be like that. Yeah. But the sustainability is not ESG, by the way, and the ESG trend is fundamentally reshaping how organizations need to handle the data.
Ultimately, I think, the way that it was going to evolve is it's not, because there's opinions across the board in this. And obviously everyone believes it's generally good, which I think it generally is. There's ways to overdo it and go into this, absolutely, really less useful directions. And there's things that are really helpful to everyone, really. So I like a situation where this is not so clear cut, because then you can separate, the good companies from the not so good companies. I don't believe that the regulator should regulate every last data point to the very last bit of it, because then, that's a risk in and of itself to make everyone equal to be able to comply with it. But just the variance of how you can implement those things is so great that it can only be helpful to have some common sense thinking around this process that you do. Yes, you're going to have to spend a few FTs, get them externally here and there, but in the grand scheme of things, this is really a drop in the ocean compared to the overall story, and it certainly helps you a lot. I mean, imagine just the way you look at those things, you understand how little management understands on the granular flows of things, because that data is not available. It's not being collected. It's not being analyzed. It's just, another aspect is you would probably go less with the gut feeling going forward. For many things, you would say, well, I trust you, but this comes back to your point with decentralized digital trust. It's like, okay, but what is the data saying, right? This also plays an aspect of it, whether this could be backed up by facts, by data storytelling, or is it just someone's leadership opinion about how things were and how things are going to go on. So I'm very, very optimistic on those topics. And I guess you you probably see this in your own line of work, advising clients.
Yes, advising different clients, you see the Gaussian distribution. You see those that think about, oh, what a burden. Okay, I've survived other things, so let's go get over with it. It's a certain mindset. But you also see those that look beyond the horizon. They understand why these regulations are in place, and they understand that if they want to be successful on the long term, they need answers, simple answers to, or let's say, answers to simple questions like what's the contribution of their organization to society? And then sustainability suddenly becomes a strategic consideration, and it should be a business priority anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. Usually it's the CFO because they have to do the reporting, but then they're coming like, okay, I need data, I need IT. And IT says, well, I need this and that and infrastructure. So all of a sudden it becomes like this initiative that cuts through the entire company, and operations, etc., is involved. So it's a, even for things like simpler businesses like banking compared to many other businesses, it's, must be said, right? I mean, it's still a challenge, right? So we see this.
Yeah, but it will change also how bankings do their investments. So, for example, right now it's probably enough to download a sustainability report if I want to invest in company A or company B. But there will be the time where you're going to ask an auditor, or let's say we are collaborating right now with very innovative companies, use ground sensors and satellite networks to measure gas emissions with an accuracy of like 5 square meters. And they precisely can tell you what the output to the atmosphere is for that company versus that company. That's going to change investment decisions, I'm sure.
100%. You could hardly imagine a situation where just being honest with the data would be a disadvantage. So I think more companies should be encouraged to invest in managing this information within their both their operations and their the whole cycle, basically from production to sales, and see how that impacts the environment, how that should play back into to the financial reporting, because the interesting aspect of it being included in the financial reporting is that, well, there's a certain liabilities if you don't, do the right things. And right.
I go as far as I would say the finance function is actually, at least in Europe, the key driver for the transformation. So if you want to transform a capitalistic system with the old values, I'm the most important, biggest, beautiful, and all these things that worked in the 2000s. So if you want to transform this, take the capitalism by the core of what it is. It's the finance.
I think do you see the finance function also playing a major role in, or let's say comparatively increasing role or decreasing role in digital transformation in general?
It's certainly a forerunner, in my opinion, because you just
it's very anecdotal, but just based on your opinion, that's exactly what I'm just...
Yeah, absolutely. That's my very personal opinion. You just said that banking, in general is a known business model, and by the nature of what it is, it always has been bits and bytes, right? Well, not always, obviously, money, how we trust in money. There it is again, trust, Well, what a leap it must be to trust in some papers that are actually worth nothing. Someone says this is now worth something. That's trust. And now we trust in bits and bytes. But in the end, to me, that is basically the whole idea, models and being a forerunner, because here for a very long time was the business. And you couldn't differentiate between IT. If you go to manufacturing, you always had this typical Michael Porter supply chain where you got the primary and the secondary value chains. That doesn't exist in a bank or in an insurance company, because the business model is about the technology. And that's why they are forerunners. And you can see it in the maturity. I've worked in Hewlett Packard for 10 years, and among other things, I was responsible for assessment services. So we assessed all kinds of organizations in different industries. You can clearly say that the banks had the highest maturity scores.
Right.
Why is that? No one wants to lose money. No one wants to lose money because of an unavailability of an IT system.
And I must say, from the data management perspective, banks are, you can clearly compare how data is managed across different industries, and data is not treated as a necessary burden, some sort of, as an afterthought of how to organize it properly at banks. Also because of regulation that we have, but just I think this is a very established thinking, and other industries have a lot of catch up to do. Even things you'd consider more like digital businesses, they would lack, having a comprehensive solution from, cataloging, governance, security, policies around access, like all of those things where a bank would know we only have our data. That's what we should be focused on. And everything else, like outlets and stores, this is just, this is transient. This is not the this is not the capital.
Yeah. It reminds me in a conversation I recently had with a CFO from a manufacturing company, and he says, okay, Mr. Müller, but keep it easy. We're not a data company. I said to him, you are, you just don't know yet.
I think it doesn't go well with every client. Yeah, some of them are more sensitive than others, but I'm also brutally honest in those things. And
phrased it in a more polite way, of course.
I know. This is why if I ever discuss this, like there are only 20 episodes later on the podcast, so you cannot trace them back to, because it's not. But yeah, the gist of it is correct. Like there are, if you look at from an external view, you can provide a different opinion based on what you've seen across industries. And certainly, that certainly is true. Yeah. So, any before we conclude this, how can people find you online or get in touch with you?
Yeah, so find me online. I'm on LinkedIn, as many people are. You can find me if you type in Markus Müller, TPA, or what you can also do is just visit our webpage, tpa-group.at, and then you find the services digitalization transformation. That's me and my team. And you'll probably also just Google for it, although there are many Markus Müllers in the German-speaking region, I have to admit.
Thanks for being my guest. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. And thanks, everyone. Bye.
Likewise. Bye-bye.